There's a body in a barrel at the bottom of Lake Mead. It has been sitting there for over 30 years. Underwater, invisible, forgotten. Nobody was looking for it. Nobody even knew it existed. And then one morning in 2022, the water simply moved back, and there it was. A rusted metal drum, half buried in silt, sitting on a lake bed that had not seen sunlight since before most people alive today were born. Inside that barrel was a man. He was wearing Trax sneakers and Vidal Sassoon jeans and a silver Timex watch. He had been shot. And nobody, not the FBI, not the detectives, not even the people who have spent years staring at the 3D facial reconstruction released to the public, knows who he is. That is not a cold case. That is a secret the lake had been keeping. And here's the part that should disturb you most. That body was not the only thing Lake Mead was hiding. Now think about what it means when a body of water the size of a small country begins to disappear. Lake Mead is not a pond. It is not a reservoir in the casual sense that word gets thrown around. When it was full, truly full, the way it was built to be, it held 3 trillion gallons of water. 9.3 trillion. It stretched across 247 square miles of Nevada and Arizona desert, reaching depths of over 500 feet in certain sections. At full capacity, the lake can reach an elevation of 1,120 feet and holds 3 trillion gallons of water. Engineers in the 1930s looked at the Colorado River, one of the most powerful rivers in the American West, and decided to stop it. They built the Hoover Dam, one of the greatest feats of human construction in the 20th century, and behind that dam, a lake grew. It took years to fill. It swallowed canyons, it buried towns, it erased entire communities from the map, and for 80 years, the water sat there, a blue mirror in the desert, deep and still and silent, holding everything it had consumed at the bottom of its dark floor. Then the water started to leave, not all at once, not in a dramatic flood or sudden drain, slowly, inch by inch. Year by year, water levels at the lake have been receding steadily since 2000, largely due to increased consumption levels, less than average rainfall, high evaporation levels, and extensive drought conditions over western parts of the country. For most of the early 2000s, people noticed the bathtub ring, a pale white stripe of calcium carbonate left on the canyon walls where the waterline used to be. But they told themselves it was temporary, a dry spell, the kind of thing that corrects itself. Nature has rhythms after all. The rain would come back. The snow would fall in the mountains. The Colorado River would surge again, and the lake would fill, and everything would return to the way it had been. It never did. The reservoir expanded since 1937, covering up multiple archaeological digs, and even submerging St. Thomas, a Mormon settlement. Over the past few years, though, the underwater settlement has been revealed several times. That is where you need to pause and truly absorb what that sentence means. A town. An entire functioning human settlement, with streets, with houses, with businesses, with a community of people who had built lives in the Nevada desert, was drowned by rising water when the Hoover Dam was completed. The residents were given notice. They packed what they could carry, they watched the water rise, they left. And then, for decades, St. Thomas simply ceased to exist as a place you could visit, a place you could stand in, a place you could see. It became a ghost town in the most literal sense of the phrase. A town that existed only as a ghost, invisible beneath hundreds of feet of water. But here is where it gets strange. Around 2002, as the water receded, the town that hadn't seen daylight in decades reemerged. St. Thomas has been exposed for at least 20 years now, and there are a lot of foundations from houses, from businesses. There's tree stumps still in place along the main street. One park official noted, tree stumps, still in place, still standing in the ground where they were planted before the Second World War. You walk down what used to be the main street of a Nevada town, and there are the skeletal remains of structures that were last inhabited by living people before television existed, before commercial air travel was common, before the atomic bomb. The water preserved them, the darkness preserved them, and now the disappearing lake was returning them to the world, one dry season at a time. But the town was not the only thing coming back. Near the busy marinas of Hemingway Harbor, the sunken wreck of a World War II-era Higgins boat emerged from the retracting waters. Its ribbed frame rises from the surface like the washed-up skeleton of a prehistoric fish. The long craft has been partially gutted, its engine removed. Murky waters and layers of silt conceal the remainder of the boat's U-shaped design, which the park says is still wrapped in its armored plating. A Higgins boat, the same type of landing craft that carried American soldiers onto the beaches of Normandy on the morning of June 6, 1944. The same design that D-Day planners considered so critical that General Eisenhower once credited it as a decisive factor in winning the war. One of those boats had been sitting on the floor of Lake Mead, still armored, still largely intact, waiting in the dark for 80 years. And when the water pulled back, there it was, a relic of the deadliest conflict in human history, rising out of a Nevada reservoir like a ghost that refused to stay buried. Think about what the lake was doing. Think about what it was hiding. The most remarkable shipwreck remains underwater, a B-29 Superfortress, a World War II-era bomber that crashed during a training mission in 1948. The wreckage remains intact on the lakebed, and certified divers can visit this historic site to witness a piece of aviation history submerged beneath the waters. A B-29, the most technologically advanced aircraft of its era, the same type of plane that carried the atomic bombs dropped over Japan, an entire bomber sitting on the floor of Lake Mead, intact, preserved by the cold, dark water, waiting. And these are only the things we know about. These are only the things the water has chosen so far to give back. And this is where everything changes. Because until this point, what I have described to you is fascinating. It is dramatic. It is the kind of story that gets written up in travel magazines and history blogs. Sunken towns, wartime artifacts, mysterious barrels. It reads like an adventure, but that framing is a distraction. Because the real story of Lake Mead is not about what the water is revealing. The real story is about what happens when the water is completely gone. And according to the latest federal data, that is no longer a hypothetical scenario. That is a projection. That is a trajectory. That is where this is heading right now in real time as you watch this video. Lake Mead slipped below 1,050 feet above sea level recently, crossing a sobering threshold as the nation's largest reservoir slides toward historically low water levels. Sitting at just 35% of its total capacity and roughly 180 feet below full pool, the reservoir behind Hoover Dam is on a trajectory that experts say could carry it past its 2022 record low of 1,040 feet, and well beyond. Read that again, 35%. The largest reservoir in the United States is 1/3 full. The bathtub ring on its canyon walls is not a stripe anymore. It is a scar. It is a record of loss that stretches hundreds of feet up the rock face, marking every year of decline like rings on a dying tree. Federal projections released by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation show that Lake Mead water levels could drop to 1,020 feet by July 2027, more than 20 feet lower than the record low the lake hit in July 2022, 20 feet lower than the worst level ever recorded. Not someday. Not in a theoretical worst-case modeling scenario. By the summer of 2027, that is not a distant future. That is 18 months away. That is next year. But here's what most people are not seeing. The conversation around Lake Mead always focuses on the water level as if it is simply a measurement, a number, something for scientists and engineers to track on a graph. What gets lost in that framing is the human architecture built on the assumption that this water would always be there. The Hoover Dam does not just hold water, it generates power. More than 40 million people rely on the Colorado River system for water, according to the Bureau. Another 5 million people are supplied by hydropower conducted in the Colorado River's hydroelectric facilities, such as the Hoover and Glen Canyon dams. When Herbert Hoover's engineers designed this system in the 1920s and 1930s, they made a calculation about how much water the Colorado River would carry. They built everything, the dam, the turbines, the intake towers, the water distribution network, around that calculation. And that calculation was wrong. Back then, Hoover predicted that the population of the Colorado River basin might quadruple. It was 457,000 people at the time, so that's 83 million. Well, right now we're at 40 million people in the basin. 40 million people, though where Hoover expected fewer than 2 million, the infrastructure was never designed for this. The river was never sized for this. And now the entire American Southwest, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Tucson, Los Angeles, San Diego, and dozens of smaller cities and agricultural communities, is discovering in real time what happens when you build a civilization on an assumption that turned out to be incorrect. And the crisis is accelerating. This isn't a situation caused by one bad snow year. The Colorado River system is operating under an increasingly warmer, drier climate. The West had been dealing with a decades-long mega-drought before atmospheric rivers in the winters of 2023 and 2024 inundated the region with enough moisture to cause extreme flooding. That detail is critical and almost universally misunderstood. The storms of 2023 and 2024, the ones that flooded California, the ones that sent rivers surging, the ones that briefly raised Lake Mead's levels and gave water managers a cautious moment of relief, those storms did not fix the problem. They paused it. They interrupted a decline that had been building for more than 2 decades. And then, once the atmospheric rivers stopped, the decline resumed, faster than before. Record low snowpack was followed by a heat wave in March that served as a knockout punch for lack of runoff leading to the reservoirs. Snow is not just precipitation. Snow is storage. When it falls in the mountains of Colorado and Utah and Wyoming, it accumulates all winter and then melts slowly through spring and summer, feeding the rivers over months in a controlled, gradual release that the entire downstream water system depends on. When the snowpack is thin, or when it melts too fast, driven by temperatures that are arriving earlier and reaching higher than any historical baseline, that storage disappears. The mountains drain quickly, the rivers run briefly, and the reservoirs that depend on that long, slow melt never fully recover. Snow accumulates at higher elevations and slowly melts over the warmer seasons, providing a consistent supply of water over time. And not all snow is the same. Light, fluffy snow contains less liquid water than thick, heavy snow. The West is getting less snow. The snow it does get is lighter, and it is melting earlier. Every one of those factors moves in the same direction. All of them point toward less water in Lake Mead. Now understand what that means for power. When Lake Mead falls to around 1,035 feet above sea level, only 5 of the dam's 17 turbines can operate. That means a potential 40% reduction in power output, enough to affect homes across Nevada, Arizona, and California. 17 turbines currently generating electricity for millions of homes and businesses across 3 states. 5 turbines. If the projections hold, and the Bureau of Reclamation's own numbers say they very likely will, by the fall of this year, Hoover Dam could be running at less than 1/3 of its normal power output. Not because anything broke, not because of a failure of engineering or maintenance, simply because the water that the turbines need to spin is not there anymore. The combination of the lowest snowpack on record and record-breaking March heat has further intensified drought conditions across the basin. These compounding factors are creating elevated risks to essential water and power infrastructure that supply water to more than 40 million people, underscoring the need for immediate action. The federal government's own language is extraordinary when you read it carefully. Elevated risks to essential water and power infrastructure. This is not the language of a manageable situation. This is not the bureaucratic vocabulary of routine adjustment. This is the language of crisis, of infrastructure, dams, turbines, intake towers, facing conditions they were never built to survive. And then there is the problem nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. The 7 states that count on the river disagree on a long-term plan to deal with the shifting climate. Current guidelines, including the 2007 Interim Guidelines, 2019 Drought Contingency Plans, and international agreements, are all set to expire at the end of 2026, leaving a critical void that must be filled with comprehensive strategies. The legal framework that governs who gets Colorado River water, and how much, and when, the entire architecture of water rights and interstate agreements that the American Southwest has operated under for decades, expires this year, and the states cannot agree on what comes next. The lower basin states of Arizona, California, and Nevada argue that the upper basin states of Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming should face mandatory cuts to their water allocations, while the upper basin states counter that they shouldn't have to, because they already collectively use less than their allocated amounts. 7 states, 1 river, 40 million people, and a negotiation that has already missed its federal deadline, with the drought worsening by the month. This is not chaos. This is the architecture of a civilization beginning to exceed the limits of its environment. Meanwhile, back at Lake Mead, something else is quietly happening, something that deserves its own conversation, because it represents a new category of threat that most people have not yet connected to the water crisis. In 2024, the combined estimated water use of 23 southern Nevada data centers exceeded 716 million gallons, an amount roughly equivalent to the yearly needs of about 395 single-family homes. Data centers. The invisible infrastructure of the digital economy, the server farms that power Google searches and YouTube streams, and cloud computing for millions of people, uses water for cooling. Enormous quantities of water. And an increasing number of those data centers have been built in the Las Vegas region, directly adjacent to a reservoir that is running out of water. Several data centers are located in the Las Vegas area near Lake Mead, including Google's Henderson Data Center and Switch's The Core Campus. Google's center is part of the infrastructure that underpins services such as Search, Maps, YouTube, and Google Cloud. Industry sources describe the Henderson facility as roughly 750,000 square feet with about 60 megawatts of capacity. The companies building these centers insist they are working on conservation and water reclamation. Google has said its 2023 water stewardship work replenished more water to the Colorado River Basin than its Henderson facility consumed. But the broader point stands: the most water-stressed region in the United States is simultaneously one of the fastest-growing hubs for a water-intensive industry. The digital world we all depend on is being built in the desert above a shrinking lake, drawing from a river that cannot sustain what is already being asked of it. And the consequences are already spreading beyond the desert. The strain is already rippling beyond the desert southwest. Denver Water recently approved drought pricing that will raise outdoor water bills for roughly 5 million customers, underscoring how shortages tied to poor snowpack and river stress are increasingly translating into higher costs for urban water users. Denver, a city that sits in Colorado at the headwaters of the river system, more than 1,000 miles from the Hoover Dam, is already paying higher water bills because of what is happening to Lake Mead. The crisis is not contained to Nevada or Arizona. It is not a regional problem that people in other parts of the country can watch from a comfortable distance. The Colorado River is the circulatory system of the American West. When it weakens, everything it feeds begins to weaken too. Go back to that body in the barrel. Found inside a rusted barrel near Hemingway Harbor, the unidentified man had been shot and left submerged for over 30 years. He wore Trax brand sneakers, light blue Vidal Sassoon jeans, and a silver Timex watch. Despite a 3D facial reconstruction released by the FBI and widespread media coverage, his identity remains unknown. He is still unidentified. As of today, nobody knows who he is. Nobody knows who put him in that barrel. Nobody knows whether the people responsible are alive or dead, free or imprisoned, aware of what the lake has now revealed. He went into the water as a secret in the late 1970s or early 1980s, when Lake Mead was full and dark and capable of holding whatever was given to it. He came out of the water as a mystery because the lake no longer had the depth to keep him hidden. This area, which is experiencing its driest period in 200 years, has seen the discovery of at least 5 sets of human remains in recent months. 5 sets of remains in a single year, in a single lake, some of them drowning victims, some of them, like the man in the barrel, something else entirely. Lake Mead is considered the most dangerous national park site, with over 250 deaths in the last decade. Due to its close proximity to Las Vegas, there is also a rumor that the mob used the lake as a way to discard bodies. Las Vegas built its identity on controlled risk, the calculated gamble, the high-stakes bet, the performance of danger within a framework of safety. The mob era of Las Vegas, the 1960s and 1970s and early 1980s, was a period when that city operated by different rules, when debts were settled differently, when people who caused problems for certain kinds of businessmen sometimes disappeared. Lake Mead, deep and close and reliably silent, was a logical place to make things disappear. The lake kept those secrets for decades. Now it is giving them back. Robert Rowe vanished after allegedly murdering his wife and stepson in their Las Vegas home in 1997. His abandoned sailboat was found drifting at Lake Mead, but Rowe himself was never seen again. Did he die by suicide? Or did he stage his disappearance to avoid justice? Nobody knows. The lake is not finished talking. Every inch the waterline drops exposes more lake bed, more silt, more of whatever was consigned to the deep in the decades when the water was high enough to keep secrets. Park rangers anticipated finding more bodies as the lake continues to dry up. That sentence was not speculation. It was an acknowledgement that they understood what kind of place this is, what kind of history sits on its floor. But step back from the bodies. Step back from the mob mythology and the cold cases and the forensic drama, because as compelling as all of that is, it is still not the most important story here. The most important story is one that is unfolding right now in federal offices and state capitals and agricultural boardrooms and city water departments across the entire American West. It is a story about what happens when the assumptions on which a civilization was built turn out to be wrong, and the civilization has grown too large and too complex and too entrenched to simply adjust. For more than 20 years, the amount of water stored in Lake Mead has declined as Colorado River water uses have exceeded supplies. And climate change is making this worse, said Jennifer Pitt, National Audubon Society's Colorado River Program Director. Today, Lake Mead is 36% full or 64% empty with little chance. It will refill absent changes in river management. 64% empty. That is the accurate framing. Not 36% full, that is the framing of false reassurance. 64% of the largest reservoir in the United States is gone. Dried, evaporated, consumed, turned into agricultural runoff and shower water and golf course irrigation and swimming pools and now server cooling systems. 64% of what was supposed to be there is simply not there anymore. All 5 of the Bureau of Reclamation's proposed plans for managing future water releases would fail under the current drought conditions. Read that sentence carefully. The government's own planners looked at every option they had developed for managing the Colorado River crisis, modeled them against the conditions that currently exist, and found that not one of them works. Every proposed solution fails. This is not a political statement. This is not alarmism from environmental groups. This is the Bureau of Reclamation, the federal agency, whose entire purpose is managing exactly this kind of water system, telling Congress and the public that the tools they have built are not sufficient for the reality they face. And yet Lake Mead's crisis is competing for attention in a political environment where water rights are deeply contested, where agricultural interests clash with urban needs, where 7 states cannot agree on what sacrifice looks like or who should bear it. After already missing a federally mandated February deadline to establish a new plan, the 7 basin states remain at odds on how to proceed. The deadline passed. The states kept arguing. The lake kept dropping. Every day without a binding agreement is another day of a system running on expired rules toward a future that those rules were never designed to address. Here is the larger truth that the lake is teaching us. whether we want to learn it or not. The 20th century was the century of American water engineering, the century of Hoover Dam and the Central Valley Project and the Colorado River Compact of 1922. Engineers and politicians looked at the rivers of the West and decided to control them, redirect them, store them, and distribute them according to negotiated agreements. And for a while, for much of the 20th century, it worked. Cities bloomed in the desert, farmland spread across land that no previous generation would have considered cultivable. Las Vegas grew from a railroad outpost to a metropolis of 2 million people in the middle of one of the driest environments on the planet. The engineering worked, the water was there, the math balanced, the math no longer balances. Because of drought and increased water usage demands, the lake has been below full capacity since 1983, and drought conditions upstream from Lake Mead in 2026 are particularly severe. 1983. That is the last time the lake was truly full. Most people alive today have never seen Lake Mead the way it was designed to be. The generation that built Hoover Dam, that filled this reservoir, that watched the water rise over St. Thomas and the Higgins boats and the canyon walls, they are all gone now. What they left behind is an infrastructure that was designed for a wetter world, and we are living in a drier one, and the gap between those two realities is what you see when you look at the bathtub ring rising up the canyon walls like an accusation. Satellite imagery captured by Landsat 7, a joint mission of the United States Geological Survey and NASA, shows a stark contrast in Lake Mead's water levels between July 1999 and May 2024, with the reservoir appearing noticeably smaller in the latter image. 25 years of satellite photographs. A lake visibly, measurably, undeniably smaller. Not a little smaller, not marginally reduced, transformed. The satellite can see it from space. The canyon walls display it in white calcium carbonate script. The numbers from the Bureau of Reclamation confirm it in hard data. And yet the political system has so far been unable to respond with anything matching the scale of the problem. What is coming in the next 12 to 18 months is not uncertain. The projections are clear. The shrunken releases from Lake Powell will accelerate declining water levels in Lake Mead, potentially reducing Hoover Dam's hydropower generating capacity by 40% as early as this fall. This fall, not a distant scenario, not a worst-case modeling outcome, a federal government projection for what is likely to happen before the end of this calendar year. 40% of Hoover Dam's power generation gone. Communities across Nevada, Arizona, and California absorbing electricity, shortfalls at the same time they are managing water restrictions. The American Southwest running hotter and drier and more power constrained simultaneously, heading into a future for which nobody has yet produced a working plan. And still, the lake gives up its secrets. Every week, as the waterline retreats another fraction of a foot, more of the lakebed emerges. More silt-covered artifacts, more sunken boats, more of whatever was placed there deliberately or accidentally or desperately in the decades when the water ran deep. Archaeologists are watching, park rangers are watching, historians are watching, and somewhere out there, perhaps, are people watching for entirely different reasons. People who placed things in that water long ago and told themselves it would stay hidden forever because the lake would always be deep enough. The lake is telling them something different now. There's a phrase used by hydrologists when describing the Colorado River situation. They call it a structural deficit, meaning the demand on the system permanently exceeds the supply, not because of one bad year, not because of one drought or one policy failure, but because the foundational calculations were wrong from the beginning, made in a wetter decade, applied to a drier century. The 1922 Colorado River Compact divided water that, it turned out, the river never consistently had to give. And now, 100 years later, 40 million people are living inside a mathematical error. This is the story Lake Mead is telling, not just with its falling water level, not just with its emerging artifacts and unsolved murders and drowned towns, but with the fundamental question it poses to the civilization built around it. You built all of this on an assumption. You built the cities and the farms and the power grids and the data centers and the golf courses and the fountains. You built Las Vegas, in the middle of the Mojave Desert, the most improbable city on earth, on the assumption that the water would always be there. What happens now that it is not? The lake does not answer. It only recedes. Another foot, another inch, another secret given back to the surface. The bathtub ring climbs higher. The B-29 sits deeper in less water. The foundations of St. Thomas dry in the desert air they have not felt in 80 years. And the man in the barrel, still unnamed, still unidentified, watches the investigations continue from whatever vantage point the dead are given. 7 states are fighting over what is left. Federal agencies are issuing emergency orders. The guidelines that govern the whole system expire before this year is out. The replacement agreement is overdue. The states are still arguing. The snowpack is thin. The temperatures are rising. The data centers are thirsty. The turbines are slowing. And the lake keeps shrinking. The question is not whether a crisis is coming. The Bureau of Reclamation's own projections have already answered that. The The question is whether the political system, the legal architecture, and the collective will of 40 million people, spread across 7 states and multiple countries, can move fast enough and honestly enough to meet it. The question is whether Las Vegas decides to become a different kind of city, or whether it doubles down on the assumptions that built it. The question is whether the farmers of Arizona and the suburbs of Phoenix and the tech campuses of southern Nevada can agree on what it means to live within the limits of a river that was never as large as everyone pretended. History has a way of surfacing. The things we submerge, the things we sink, the things we tell ourselves the water will keep hidden. Eventually the water moves, and there they are. Lake Mead has been running this lesson for decades. Most of us just were not paying attention. The water level right now sits at roughly 1,052 feet above sea level. The projections put it at 1,020 feet by July 2027. Between here and there lies everything. The power for 3 states, the drinking water for 40 million people, the survival of agricultural economies that feed the nation, the resolution or failure of a legal framework that has already expired, and whatever else the lake is holding in its dark and shrinking floor. Nobody knows exactly what comes next. That is the truth. The scientists have their models. The engineers have their contingency plans. The lawyers have their briefs. The politicians have their hearings. But the lake is not bound by any of those documents. It responds to snowpack and temperature and the slow, unstoppable physics of evaporation in a desert that is growing hotter every decade. Something is coming. Something larger than a policy debate or a water sharing agreement or a drought contingency plan. Something the 20th century's engineers did not account for, and the 21st century's politicians have not yet figured out how to face. The water knows. It has been signaling for 20 years. The only question left is whether we are finally ready to listen.